deep inside, there's a huge part of me that's gone.
The horror is once you get out, trying to get back what you'd lost.
When you're on that side of the bars and there's no way, there's no hope, there's no crack, you give up.
Took away a big portion of my life, took away my life with my children.
I mean, what happened to the word investigation?
Helpless, fear, anger, and revenge, and wanting people to be held accountable for what had happened to me.
And why? Why did you do it? What possessed you to play God?
I knew my life was over right there.
Having my family taken away, everything taken away from me.
I had my life stolen away for 25.5 years for a crime I didn't commit. You can't get that time back.
We all love a true crime story, learning about the victim and the details of the crime, the investigation, the evidence, the arrest. Then comes the trial, defense versus prosecution, the jury's verdict and the judge's sentence, ending in justice and time served behind bars. But what happens when they all get it wrong? Welcome to Real Life Wrongs. I'm Kelly Fanson.
And I'm Kelly Lauzon.
Yes, two Kellys, but the similarities stop there. I'm a producer, writer, business owner, and a mom.
And I'm a PhD candidate and an instructor in the Department of Legal Studies at Carleton University, where I focus on the subjects of wrongful convictions and criminal jury trials.
Kelly's been studying wrongful convictions for 20 years and has many degrees that I don't have. So she's going to help me dissect the cases and explain the causes of wrongful convictions to shed light on how our justice system gets it wrong.
We'll be taking a deep dive into the crime, the time, the appeals, and the exonerations by speaking with lawyers, advocates, and exonerees. We're also going to crack open conversations about juvenile justice and marginalization because we think it's important that everyone, including young people under the age of 25, understand how our system works, what to look out for, and where changes need to occur.
Now, I heard about the David Milgaard case when I was a teenager. I heard the words wrongfully convicted. But looking back, I remember I didn't really understand it. I couldn't process that someone who had been put in jail for a horrible crime wasn't a horrible person. I was a teenager and I was taught to believe in our system of justice. Due process doesn't make mistakes. Justice doesn't fail. But the years and the evidence have shown that it does.
And what's interesting, it was also the Milgaard case that put me on my path. I remember the disgust that I felt towards our justice system. I remember the fear and the thought that this could happen to anyone. I think that these feelings are shared by many people who have heard of a high-profile case like the Central Park Five or Guy Paul Morin, maybe Stephen Truscott. And for some, this may all be new.
Or maybe you yourself have been a victim of a wrongful conviction or know someone who has. Before we dig into the rest of the episode, we want to pay tribute to David Milgaard, a Canadian man who was wrongfully convicted of rape and murder and imprisoned for 23 years. He was exonerated and dedicated his life to helping others and those caught in the web of the system. David passed away on May 15th, 2022. An individual, like many others, whose life was defined by something he didn't do. A tribute to David Milgaard.
So we've mentioned the David Milgaard case, and that's not only because his case is one of the most egregious examples of wrongful conviction in our country, but it's also because he's a hero to so many within the innocence movement. Shortly after this episode was recorded, David made the headlines once again. Only this time, it was with the news of his sudden and tragic passing. When I first got the push on my phone, I didn't believe it. I had to read the notification a few times for it to sink in. And then it hit me. Hard. I was winded. I was dazed. I was reeling. I had no words to express what I was feeling. I immediately started receiving messages from others who had been touched by David throughout their lives. Our hearts ached together, our tears flowed together, and for a moment, our worlds grew a little bit darker, knowing that David was no longer there to shine his light for us. I recently attended the annual Innocence Conference for the first time. I learned many things while I was there, but the one thing that has stayed with me, that I can't shake, are the words spoken by a group of high-profile exonerees. After having been exploited ad nauseum by the media, their message was simple: don't talk about us without us. Now, having taken on this podcast, I have to say that I'm constantly checking my reference point and ensuring that when speaking of the wrongfully convicted, that I'm not usurping their voice. And so in this moment, when I want to pay tribute to David Milgaard, I am acutely aware of his voice, of his work, and of his legacy. The path that David walked was not an easy one. He spent 23 years within the confines of some of Canada's hardest correctional facilities. He was viewed by other inmates as a rapist and a murderer, and he was treated as such. The depravity that he endured every day is enough to give anyone nightmares. And yet through it all, he never wavered in his claim to innocence. He could have falsely confessed at any time to demonstrate the requisite remorse required by the parole board, but he could never bring himself to utter those words. He knew it would be a lie. Thankfully, the truth came out, and David was eventually released and then exonerated. This, of course, is after he had grown from a teenager to a middle-aged man in prison. Upon release, I think it would have been easy to walk away from all of this and to try very hard to never think about any of this ever again. And yet David knew that this wouldn't help anyone. He knew that his suffering wasn't for nothing. And so he did everything he could to make his path a little easier for others to walk on. He knew far too well that there were others like him in prison. And he knew that there would be others like him released back to society after having been wrongfully convicted without any idea as how to live a meaningful and productive life. David's latest project was to see the creation of the Independent Wrongful Conviction Review Commission in Canada. He was firm in his belief and in his vision that we, as a country, would be best served by having everyone, not just criminal justice officials, reviewing claims of wrongful conviction. In 2019, the federal government mandated the Minister of Justice to create such a commission. Here we are, 3 years later, still in the planning and development phases. There is absolutely no question at this point that the right thing for Canada to do is to honor David's vision and to see this thing through. We cannot let this fizzle and fade like so many other governmental promises. This is the very least that we can do to ensure that David's suffering was not in vain. One of the messages I received in tribute to David was as follows, and I have to say that I could never come up with more fitting words. Some heroes are bulletproof. Some can stop an out-of-control train. But some fly in a cage made of concrete and steel. They sit locked and confined. They wait and inspire and evoke change. Some leave footsteps on an unimaginable barren landscape and forge a path for those yet to come. They lead the way. While I may not have been a close friend of David's, he touched my life deeply, like he did with everyone he met. I was privileged enough to have hosted him as a speaker at Carleton University. During his visit, I shared with him that his story is what set me on this path. It was his case that ignited a passion in me that I didn't know was there. David was humble, honored, and gracious. He found solace in the fact that his story had led to some good. We shared stories and dinner and laughs. We had a great time together, and we said that we would have to do this again. David, please know that you will be my guest at Carleton every year. You are a national hero, a legend, an inspiration, a trailblazer, an incredible human. Your light will continue to shine, and we will vehemently protect the path that you forged.
How many wrongful convictions are there? Why do they happen? How can they be prevented?
These are all great questions. And I think we can start by looking at some of the things that we do know. So according to Innocence Canada, which is our national not-for-profit organization dedicated to identifying, advocating for, and exonerating individuals convicted of a crime they didn't commit, there are currently 90 cases under review across the country. So just, looking at it across the country, there's 8 in Alberta, 18 in BC, 5 in Manitoba, 4 in New Brunswick, 2 in Newfoundland, Labrador, 2 in Nova Scotia, 1 in Nunavut, 36 in Ontario, 5 in Quebec, 9 in Saskatchewan. And there are none currently reported in Yukon, Northwest Territories, or PEI.
So those are just the cases Innocence Canada is looking at. There are also various independent innocence organizations around the country looking into cases. In the U.S., the Innocence Project, based in New York, also works to free the innocent. They report that they get about 2,400 new requests for help every year. And they estimate that they are evaluating between 6,000 and 8,000 potential cases at any given time. Yeah. So thanks to Netflix, the most talked about cases in the last 3 to 5 years, let's say, might be the coercion of confession of Brendan Dassey on the show The Making of a Murderer, and the Central Park 5, again on Netflix, titled When They See Us. A few more real-life stories turned into series or films. There's David and Me, the story of David McCallum, imprisoned for 29 years. Filmmakers Ray Klonsky and Mark Lamy set out to help their friend David McCallum, who was forced to confess to a 1985 murder he didn't commit as a teenager. Another one is Time Simply Passes. James Richardson was a citrus picker in Florida who was convicted of the deaths of his 7 children in 1968 by poisoning them. Time Simply Passes follows his conviction, his release in 1989, and the following 25 years as he battles with the state to attain a settlement through landmark legislation. After Innocence, a film that follows wrongfully convicted men freed by DNA evidence after decades in prison as they struggle to transition back into society. The Central Park 5. 5 teens from Harlem are falsely accused of a brutal attack in Central Park. And Conviction, the trials of Daryl Hunt, a documentary about the conviction and eventual exoneration of Daryl Hunt, an African-American convicted in 1984 of the rape and murder of Deborah Sykes, a white newspaper editor in North Carolina. Even though DNA evidence in 1994 proved his innocence, the North Carolina legal system didn't release Hunt until 2004. And one more, Reuben the Hurricane Carter, a middle-aged middleweight boxing hopeful, was arrested along with another man for the murders of 3 people in a New Jersey bar. Wrongfully accused, he was sentenced to 3 life terms in prison. And actually one more, in the name of the father, Jerry Conlon became the prime suspect in the IRA bombings and spent 15 years trying to clear his name. So those are just a few of the real life stories that have been made for, I guess on Netflix is where you would find these.
Yeah. And I mean, like you said, they're just a few. There are several others out there that you can check out on various media platforms. But I think what all of these examples highlight is that it may not take the justice system a long time to find you guilty, but it really takes a long time for you to prove your innocence. Here in Canada, Romeo Fillion spent 31 years in prison before he was given the opportunity to prove his innocence. In the States, Anthony Mazza spent over 47 years in prison before being exonerated.
So, without a doubt, system errors that cause wrongful convictions are alive and well. Over the years, judicial inquiries across Canada have urged for the creation of an independent commission without success, but that's changing.
Yeah, in 2019, the Trudeau government mandated the creation of an independent criminal case review commission to make it easier and faster for potentially wrongfully convicted people to have their applications reviewed. This could really be a great step forward. But the hard truth is, in Canada, we rely on hopelessly overworked and grossly underfunded volunteer organizations to do the work to undo our justice system's egregious mistakes.
So with backlogs of cases, many of them complex, it's a rare lawyer who can devote the hundreds of volunteer hours and expertise even necessary to uncover a miscarriage of justice.
Yes, and on Real Life Wrongs, you'll discover how innocent people end up behind bars with their lives devastated, their families ripped apart, and a justice system that's void of apologies or compensation.
Through detailed cases and personal interviews, we'll feature stories of convictions that will break your heart and the system errors that led to injustices that will most likely break your brain.
And we also take a close look at our justice system, not because it doesn't get it right, but because it can do better.
The trauma of a wrongful conviction doesn't end with when the prison door slams. These individuals, the ones who find it within themselves to fight for their innocence, will spend years, often decades, trying to prove they're not guilty, desperately trying to be free.
So join us in our discussions and interviews to better understand the legal system, right down to the tactics used to convict someone of a crime they didn't commit, and then the road to proving their innocence.
So, to be clear, Kelly, what is a wrongful conviction?
Right. I mean, we've been talking about it, but let's just be clear that we're talking about the same thing. So, I mean, a wrongful conviction is a conviction resulting from errors and misconduct on the part of justice officials that allow someone who is factually innocent to be convicted and sentenced for a crime that they didn't commit.
So, a gross violation of a person's due process rights.
Yeah, and it's important to know that wrongful convictions don't just happen because of the verdict that is rendered in a courtroom. They're the result of a continuum of errors throughout the entire process. So starting with wrongful accusations to wrongful arrests, false charges, the interactions with lawyers, to perceptions by the judge and the jury, right through to the wrongful conviction.
So what are some of these system errors?
So each case is unique, but I mean, they can all include anything and everything from false accusations to tunnel vision, eyewitness misidentification, police misconduct, Mr. Big Stings, false confessions, discrimination, shoddy forensics. The list goes on. We can include plea bargains, expert witnesses, bad lawyering, jailhouse informants, and honestly, the list goes on and on and on.
Yeah, a substantial list of errors, which begs the question, how many wrongful convictions are there?
This is a great question, and it's one that I'm asked often. And sadly, the best answer that I can give anyone is we don't know.
Okay. So what if that answer was half? Half the people convicted are wrongfully convicted. That would probably get a lot of attention.
Maybe. I mean, it comes down to an innate human need to quantify things. And I think that need comes from the fact that if we can assign value and we know how many times a wrongful conviction happens, we can decide how outraged we really should be. Basically, if we know how many times a wrongful conviction happens, we can decide are we really supposed to be upset by this?
Right. So mistakes are bound to happen. One may think a few flubs is a small price to pay for all the guilty people who actually do serve their time. Sort of like we lose some, but we win most.
So sure, one of the biggest problems in trying to figure out how often wrongful convictions happen is that no matter how much you maintain your innocence, it can't be said that the conviction is wrongful until a court of law says that a mistake was made. And that mistake was made somewhere along the way throughout the judicial process. So until we know what that mistake was, and until the courts can say that there was a mistake, it's only a possible or a probable wrongful conviction.
Okay, so let's say it's just one, then one wrongful conviction a year. Maybe that doesn't sound like much. But what if that one was you? Innocent, didn't do it, locked up with very little, if no chance of ever getting out, and even less chance of ever being considered truly innocent of this thing you never did. So if you were the one, would you want it to be you?
Right. And studies have been done for over 100 years now. And we still have no idea how frequently wrongful convictions happen. And because of this, we don't know with any kind of certainty how frequently wrongful convictions actually happen. And therefore, by extension, we don't know what the chance is that it might happen to you. And one of the saddest and most heartbreaking examples of this is the story of Jamie Nelson. So he was convicted of a crime that never even happened. And as a result of his wrongful conviction, he lost custody of his 5 young children. They were taken away. They were put into foster care, and 3 of them were adopted while he was in prison. And even though he was exonerated and cleared of any and all wrongdoing, he was not allowed to have contact with his kids until their 18th birthdays. I can't even imagine what it's like to know that you have kids out there who you cannot look for, you can't talk to, you essentially can't even think about them until they're legally adults. And on top of this, you're missing all of their important firsts. Their first day of school, their first job, their first date, their first graduation, everything, right? Like all the firsts, you're not there. And, on top of all that, I know that I would be driving myself crazy, wondering what they've been told about me and, what they think they know about me or my story.
And you have no control over that. And then there's the stain on someone's reputation. Although they're exonerated by the courts, this is not always the case in the community where they live. They're often, there's those whispering campaigns that persist in the communities long after an individual's been exonerated. People in the community continue to believe they're either just guilty or, guilty of something in some way.
Yeah.
Kind of like I said, in the beginning, if you've been convicted, you must be a horrible person.
Yeah. Well, and the stain on someone's reputation is something that always stuck with me. And it was Robert Baltovich who said this one time when he was speaking at one of my events. And, that just seemed to be so fitting because it's exactly what happens. So in Rob's case, he was convicted of murdering his girlfriend. And even though her body was never found, he spent 8 years in prison and then another 8 years fighting to clear his name. Finally, after 16 years, the Crown and the courts admitted there was no case against him, and he was finally exonerated. So, the Crown is saying there's no case. The courts are saying there's no case. They're all saying you didn't do it. We made a mistake. And yet, people in his community still believed he was guilty.
I have to wonder how effectively was the justice system saying, wow, we made a big mistake. Everybody, big public announcement here. Like I would think that wouldn't have been a town crier calling out.
No, I don't think there were, balloons and streamers and big celebrations about it. But locally there were things in the paper saying he's been exonerated. And again, it was more that he had been exonerated, not that mistakes had been made along the way, right? Nonetheless, he's exonerated. And yet everywhere he went, he could hear people talking about him, about what he did, or, at least what they thought he did. And he ended up having a really hard time being able to keep a job because the media wouldn't leave him alone. They all wanted their soundbite. They all wanted to hear, did you do it? Did you get away with murder? What actually happened? So, this kind of treatment really makes it tough for someone to reintegrate into society when you have these dark clouds following you everywhere you go.
Right. Okay. So if we're all taught to have faith in the criminal justice system and told that an innocent person has nothing to fear, that the system will protect you, trust the truth, we also hear over and over again, innocent until proven guilty. And it's nice to think that all people who enter the courtroom are assumed to be innocent. But the reality of the situation is that the presumption of innocence is usually flipped on its head and becomes a presumption of guilt.
Yes, it does. And this brings us to verdicts. So there are two verdicts. There's guilty and not guilty. And an important point of law in Canada is that there's a significant difference between being found not guilty of a crime and being able to establish factual innocence.
Okay, so let's say your conviction is overturned on appeal. You always hear on TV, don't worry, we'll appeal. And you are acquitted or the charges are withdrawn. Does this mean that you're factually innocent? Because I don't understand the difference.
No. So being found not guilty is not the same as being completely innocent. And the challenge that a lot of wrongfully convicted people have is that they have to establish factual innocence, not legal innocence.
So what's the difference between legal and factual innocence?
So factual innocence is when you've been wrongfully convicted and punished, likely imprisoned, for a crime that you had no part in.
Okay, had no part in. What does that specifically mean?
So after the conviction, you can prove, or your lawyers can prove, through some form of incontrovertible proof that you were not involved in this crime in any way. So there's zero doubt about your innocence. And, like I said, through DNA, but it could also be something like you're charged and convicted for a murder, and then the supposed victim turns up alive. Clearly,
right.
You didn't.
Okay, so yeah, no doubt. Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Never thought about breaking down innocence before. How about legal innocence?
So legal innocence isn't so clear cut. These are cases where somebody may have actually committed the crime, but justice officials resorted to abuses of power or procedural errors that prevented a fair trial.
So being able to establish factual innocence is so important. Imagine the massive hurdle a wrongfully convicted person has to face in having to prove a negative. How do you prove that you weren't somewhere, that you didn't do something?
Exactly. And it is so important. If you look at the case of Stephen Trescott, you can really see why being able to establish factual innocence is so important. So just for context, Stephen was a 14-year-old boy, and he was convicted of raping and murdering his classmate after he gave her a ride on his bicycle. And according to Stephen, he dropped her off at the side of the road as per her request. And that was the last time that anyone saw her alive. 2 days later, her body was found. She'd been sexually assaulted and strangled with her own blouse. There really was no evidence linking Stephen to the murder. And yet the police charged him, brought him to trial. A bunch of questionable evidence was entered against him, and he was ultimately found guilty. It took 48 hours for that investigation to happen. And it then took 48 years for him to establish on appeal that it was very likely that the wrong person had been convicted in this case. And, that means that Stephen ended up serving a sentence for a crime that he didn't commit. But the smoking gun was still missing. There was no DNA evidence because it's 48 years later. There was no confession by the real killer. And so in the mind of the Court of Appeal, there was still a possibility that Stephen may have been the killer. So until he could provide something incontrovertible, we can only say that he was probably wrongfully convicted.
So to fully appreciate the scope or reach of the injustice of wrongful convictions, we can look at three primary problems. The first and most obvious being that an innocent person is convicted and punished for a crime. The second problem is the guilty person is still out there. So while an innocent person is being punished for something he or she didn't do, the public is vulnerable to further attacks by the same offender who is still free.
Yeah. And a great example of this is the David Milgaard case. So again, for context, there'd been a series of sexual assaults in Saskatoon, and finally one ended up in a murder. And it happened just when David Milgaard was in town that same day. Police took no time finding a suspect. And once they arrested Milgaard, he was convicted, and they assumed that they had their guy in custody. So they stopped looking into these sexual attacks in Saskatoon. They didn't stop. They just stopped making any kind of connection because they figured they had their serial rapist in custody. And it wasn't until many years later, like 20 some odd years later, that Larry Fisher was proven to be the true perpetrator via DNA testing. So during that time that Milgaard was serving Larry Fisher's sentence, essentially, there were at least 4 other women who fell victim to Larry Fisher's assaults.
Right. So to give further proof of how society continues to be victimized after a wrongful conviction, let's talk about an important study done by the Innocence Project in 2016. By the way, the Innocence Project, I think we've already stated, is an organization out of New York that helps to exonerate the innocent through DNA testing. So the Innocence Project mission is to free the staggering number of innocent people who remain incarcerated and bring reform to the system.
Yeah. So the study that you're talking about, it included a sample of 344 people who were wrongfully convicted. And in 148 cases, so it's pretty much half of the cases, the true perpetrators were later identified and convicted thanks to DNA evidence. So there were, 148 crimes that went on, and they weren't minor crimes. We're talking there were 34 murders and 77 sexual assaults as part of this group.
Avoidable crimes.
Yes, absolutely. And while we're just talking about issues, the scope of wrongful convictions also reaches the victim and their family, right? Which is a third problem that is caused by wrongful convictions. Imagine you've spent years believing that the perpetrator, the murderer, was caught and punished. And then all these years later, you're told, oh, sorry, we made a mistake, and the real criminal is actually still out there.
Sure. And there's also the social and psychological aspects created by wrongful convictions, which is what you're talking about. You know, a social harm for someone wrongfully accused might be when a partner is deprived of support when their spouse has been wrongfully convicted, right? Or divorce or separation when a partner questions if they even want to be married to someone who's been convicted of a heinous crime. A spouse might have second thoughts about the relationship. At the very least, trust would be a big obstacle, as well as parental absence is, of course, a devastating problem. The wrongfully convicted parent is no longer able to raise their children, again, causing separation or estrangement, having harmful effects and causing long-term trauma on children.
Yeah. And this is a widespread problem for sure.
Yeah, I can only imagine the psychological harm that occurs in prison, regardless of innocence or guilt, right? There's a trauma there. And to be locked up innocent, that's a real psychological twist. Yeah. I know that many have haunting flashbacks years after their release. Many attempt suicide while in prison because of the despair that they feel given their situation. Others turn to substance abuse, as we know, as a means to attempt to cope. And most of these individuals did not have a drug problem before going into jail.
Yeah. Sadly, there are far too many examples that we could talk about when it comes to this kind of problem. But I'll just bring up a couple just so we can see the different facets of, how far reaching this is. So Ivan Henry, he was released after being incarcerated for 27 years. And when he was released, he went to live with his daughter, and he refused to leave the house because he was so afraid the police would take him away again. And his daughter reported that Ivan would wake up every night screaming from night terrors, and he'd have scratches on his face because he was dreaming that he was fighting people off of him. Right. And another example, just another problem is Romeo Filion, who was our longest serving wrongfully convicted individual in Canada. So he was convicted in 1972, and he spent 31 years in prison, as I mentioned. And when he was released, I remember him telling me this story about when he was released, and he's walking around Toronto, and he had nowhere in particular to go. He was just enjoying being out for a walk because he could go where he wanted and not where people were telling him to go. And he's walking down the street, and he gets to a bank, and he stops dead in his tracks, and he's staring into a bank and couldn't figure out what was going on. So I'm listening to him telling me this story, and now I'm confused. And I said to him, like, okay, Romeo, I know you were gone for a long time, but surely there were banks in 1972. Like, this wasn't new to you. And, he looks at me and he says, of course we had banks, Kelly, but the walls were spitting money. And it hit me that he had been gone for so long, he had no idea what an ATM was, right? To him, people just walked up to a wall, held out their hands, and money fell into their hands.
Wow, so, that's like heaven.
Indeed, right? But it just shows how far removed these people are. And then they're just thrown back into the world, expected to be able to pick up and carry on. And so much has changed.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And, the last example that I have for this is, again, Jamie Nelson. Right. And this is on the complete other end of the spectrum, I think. So Jamie was a baker by trade. Like, he's a Red Seal baker. And while he was in prison, he witnessed a man murdered with a shiv made of pencils sharpened to different lengths right in front of him. So, this really isn't the typical day of the life of a baker. And yet now this is what he has to deal with on a daily basis. Right. And you're supposed to just Sorry, you're just supposed to get on with your...
Yeah. No, I just hear you. Like, I can't imagine all of the things he must have seen, from puff pastries to prison. Bam.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about another harm that blows my mind. After the wrongfully convicted individual goes through the process of trying to prove their innocence, and succeeds and is set free, it sounds like a happy ending, but when they're let out of prison, that individual doesn't receive support, money, or counseling. And they're expected to simply reintegrate. And I was shocked to discover that people who are guilty, actually guilty for a crime where they serve their time, they're released and are given support to integrate back into society. So it makes sense, seeing as in many cases, an individual may have been behind bars for years or even decades. I just don't understand why you're guilty and you served your time and you get support on the outside. But if you are found, if the system was to blame and you're released, it's just kind of like, there's the door.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And, again, like you say, so if we compare, if you commit a crime and you serve 2/3 of your sentence, you're let out on statutory release to halfway home with a probation officer, and then some conditions for reintegration to ensure that this is done successfully, right? And then the wrongfully convicted, they're just let out.
So what do they get?
Nothing. They don't get anything.
I think we can all relate to that feeling of being accused of something we didn't do. Think back in your life to a time when someone even said something about you that wasn't true. That's hurtful enough and makes you want to set the record straight. Then even worse, think to a time when you were blamed for something you didn't do. Maybe you were accused of, I don't know, cheating, stealing the office stapler. Okay, maybe you did that. But seriously, we've all had blame misplaced upon us. People create elaborate webs. And, the question is, have you ever been caught in one? And, can you relate to what that feels like? Further still, imagine you're accused and tried for a heinous crime, and society now has its finger pointed at you, and you serve time in jail, perhaps decades of your life for this crime you didn't commit. Then what? We just say, sorry, chum, life's not fair.
Yep, pretty much that's exactly what happens, except there usually isn't a sorry attached to that statement. Canada doesn't have any requirement to provide compensation to victims of a miscarriage of justice. The closest we ever came was in 1988, when the federal and provincial governments came together and they came up with a set of guidelines for compensation. So, this might sound promising, but they're guidelines. They're not laws. They're not policy. They're not rules. They're guidelines. So basically, recommendations. And that means they can't be enforced in any way. And on top of that, the guidelines are pretty restrictive. So, one of the biggest things is that the person seeking compensation has to be able to provide a document from an official confirming that they did not commit the offense. So they need someone to sign off on their factual innocence. And even if they can get someone to do this, because these are just guidelines, there's huge disparity in the amount that you're going to get as compensation.
Yeah, this sounds like a real long shot at getting any kind of compensation from the system that locked you up for so long.
Yeah. And, really the best shot, if you even want to call it that, is if someone wants compensation, they have to sue the government or the Crown or the police or, whoever for compensation. So just let's stop for a second and think about that. you have one person who's been in prison for however many years, and now they have to sue the government, right? And on top of that, in Canada, whoever brings a civil suit forward is responsible for paying the other side's legal fees if they're unsuccessful. So you're suing the government, who has unlimited access to resources. And if you lose, you have to pay the government's costs, like all the costs that they incurred fighting you in court. So this is obviously going to deter most wrongfully convicted people from following this route, which, I mean, basically just brings us right back to prison doors are open and you're let out and you're expected to reintegrate successfully and have no support to lean on.
So how can this even be? Like, this just doesn't even make sense.
Yeah, I guess the logic behind it is that supports are meant for people who need help in building a better life when they get out of prison. And, you know, you were innocent all along, so you must still be that same kind of person. So you don't fit the criteria of needing help.
You know, Kelly, with so many years of experience researching cases as you have done, does anything surprise you? Or better yet, when was the last time you were genuinely surprised by the information you learned about a case?
I always feel like I'm getting jaded or calloused or, I don't know, something when I'm asked this question. You know, or when people, they tell me how surprised they are when they hear about the details of a wrongful conviction. And my reaction is always just, yeah, that's what happens. And, you know, it hit me, I think it was when Make a Murderer came out and everybody was up in arms about it. And I'm sitting here going, yeah, it's pretty much what happens, right? And I realized that nothing really surprises me anymore. And I think after you've been studying wrongful convictions for, 20 plus years, as I've been doing, and I've had the chance to speak with exonerees and I've heard their stories firsthand, I think that I've pretty much seen it or heard it all in one way or another. But that being said, the courage and the dignity and the resolve that I see in each of the exonerees that I get the chance to speak with never ceases to amaze me. And I always leave those conversations thinking that they are so much better people than I could ever be.
Yeah. And maybe there comes a point where this is an area where less surprises, the better.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I mean, you don't want to start hearing about a whole bunch of, additionally horrible things going on in the justice system. But okay, for real. So the last time that I was genuinely surprised, and probably it was a conversation I had with Jamie Nelson, and this is a number of years ago. And I remember him just telling me about the horrible things he had to live through while he was in prison for a crime that he didn't commit, for a crime that never even actually happened. And honestly, the things that he was telling me were straight out of the worst horror film that you could think of. And, I think we can all imagine how horrible prison life is. But until you actually hear the details firsthand from somebody who lived through it, you honestly can't understand what it's like. And
we'll be hearing Jamie's story in our Tunnel Vision episode.
Yes, absolutely.
So this isn't just like a tease to be like, you'll never understand. It's like, we're going to hear from Jamie firsthand.
It's true. It's true. No, but I just mean that until you've heard it from somebody, you honestly, you think you understand, you don't. So anyways, and the last time that a case surprised me, I have to say it's the case of Dr. Charles Smith. And I just want to make a point of saying in my class, we always referred to him as doctor with air quotes. And the air quotes are 100% mandatory. Long story short, he somehow became the chief pediatric forensic pathologist in Canada. And I say somehow because he had
more air quotes.
Oh yeah. And question marks. Right. He had no training. He had no credentials in this area. And yet somehow he went on to perform over 1,000 autopsies on deceased babies and toddlers. And when he's doing these autopsies, he was notorious for infusing his own moral compass and his own judgments into his decisions. And so by doing this, he would find evidence of crimes that never happened. And because of these judgments, there are at least 14 people who were wrongfully convicted in Canada based on his findings. And Innocence Canada is still fighting to have 3 of those convictions quashed. Keep in mind, this all came to light in 2008. We're now in 2022. We're well aware that Dr. Charles Smith is discredited, and yet their exonerations are not guaranteed, right? Like this is a long, long road. So anyways, I digress. When I learned that there was one man who had such a catastrophic effect on so many innocent people, that was mind-blowing for me. I mean, it was to the point that mothers were falsely confessing to having murdered their children just to avoid facing him in court.
And we will be speaking to one of those mothers in another episode. But all of this says a lot about our justice system. You know, whether we like it or not, it seems our system chooses to prosecute crime at the risk of a wrongful conviction.
Yeah. Yeah. And it all comes down to a cost-benefit analysis. And what I mean by this is that, you know, the system is willing to assume a few costly mistakes if it benefits the majority of the population. So really, as long as most people are satisfied with the system, then, you know, we shouldn't be interfering or making suggestions for change.
In a nutshell, wrongful convictions bring the competence and the integrity of the justice system into question, and they expose the reality of it. At times, the reality that the system can turn on the very people it is intended to protect.
Yeah. And, you know, like we said earlier, a human system will have human error.
Well, does that mean our system will always be inherently broken?
Not if we're diligent and we keep improving it to help the system function in the way that it's supposed to, right? As long as we can work to ensure that it's convicting the people who are truly guilty, I think we're okay.
Okay, so how does the justice system guard against a wrongful conviction?
I think we pretty much have to accept that a certain amount of wrongful convictions are going to happen because our justice system is a human system, and humans are always going to make mistakes no matter how hard we try to do things right.
The justice system, though, needs to own the mistakes of each wrongful conviction, apologize to the exonerees, and support these people after exoneration. Instead, it seems like the whole mess of it is hidden from public view.
Absolutely true. And I think it's because a wrongful conviction is usually presented as an exception. It's an unfortunate event. It's an anomaly. And really, it's presented this way because they're a black eye on the system. They reveal the justice system's vulnerabilities.
So, okay, let's talk about what we do know. The U.S. currently has over 3,000 known cases of wrongful convictions as of today. Let's say very little research has been conducted to determine the number of people who have been wrongfully convicted in Canada. where we are, but they say there are about 70 known cases. I kind of like do my little air quotes over known cases. Compared to the states, that doesn't seem like much.
No, it doesn't. But I think we have to remember it's really tough to draw a direct comparison between ourselves and the states because they have 10 times our population. So if we had the same number of wrongful convictions as them, that's actually a really terrifying thought. And unlike the states, we have a lack of transparent numbers because we don't have a national registry of exonerations like they do. And, we have to look at how they use the prison system in relation to how we use the prison system. The Americans use prison as punishment far more often than we do. And, you can see this just by looking at the number of people in prisons in Canada versus the US. We have one of the lowest numbers of incarcerations per capita around the world versus the US has the highest incarceration rate worldwide with about 2 million people in prison compared to our 40,000.
The exposure of wrongful convictions often creates a loss of confidence, I guess, in the justice system. And the system doesn't want that. But that doesn't change the fact that they happen. And that loss of confidence leaves us to also wonder, could this happen to me?
Yeah. And, we generally only hear about the high profile cases. So it doesn't quite hit home that this happens far more often than we think. And, the reality is it can happen to anyone.
All right. So we know there are people in prison right now who shouldn't be there. What do we have to do? How hard is it for them to get out?
Yeah. So the wheels of justice do not move quickly. There are a lot of steps and a lot of hoops that a wrongfully convicted person has to go through to get exonerated, right? And first and foremost, you have to be able to prove that you have new evidence when you appeal, right? And this new evidence, you have to be able to establish that it would have significantly impacted the jury and swayed them in your favor at the original trial. So let's say you come up with this evidence and you present it and you're successful, right? You would then probably be ordered to go to trial all over again. So you're starting from scratch. If your appeal is not successful, you have to start all over again by appealing to the Supreme Court. And again, you have to have good reason for appealing to the Supreme Court. So if you're successful there, you'll probably be ordered to stand trial again. If you're not successful at the Supreme Court, you have exhausted all of your appeal options. And the only thing left for you is to file an application for ministerial review with the Minister of Justice. So in Canada, it's called a 696 application. Long story short, each of these steps takes years to complete. So depending how many you have to go through, could be decades before you can prove your innocence and be exonerated.
Phew, I'm exhausted. As we will reveal through speaking with actors in the system and stories from exonerees, sometimes simply being innocent is not enough to ensure that you won't get swept away by the system's current. The stories of the wrongfully convicted should serve as a stark reminder that this can happen to anyone, that anyone can be you. Thanks for listening. I'm Kelly Fanson.
And I'm Kelly Lauzon.
The world of wrongful convictions is a living hell for individuals who end up in it. And believe it or not, it could happen to anyone. Know the law, know how to look for flaws in the system, understand how marginalization works, and most of all, talk about it. Thanks for listening. I'm Kelly Fanson.
And I'm Kelly Lauzon.
For excerpts and additional information about our podcast and the world of wrongful convictions, follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. You can watch video portions of our podcast on YouTube and Instagram. And if you'd like more information, visit our website, realliferongs.com. Drop us a line.
All of us could falsely confess to something.
They blew it all out of proportion, and they got away with it.
Even a country like Canada has people who are charged and convicted of crimes they didn't commit.
There's innocent people who are going to die in prison.
I can't get back the time that they took from me.
And I was just left wondering, like, what the hell is happening?
I knew my life was over right there. That's when my life ended.
They're changing the story that I told them to match to what really happened.
I was just incarcerated for 37 years for somebody else's crime.
That what happened to me could easily happen to anybody.
Real Life Wrongs is produced by Kelly Fanson, edited by Alex Glutch, promotional materials by Jamie Norrie.